Thanks for joining us today for creating a welcoming and inclusive environment and services for LGBTQ people. We are joined by our presenter, Molly Herman, who has for more than a decade provided training to providers about LGBTQ intimate partner violence, engaged LGBTQ communities, and conducted research to develop support systems. She's a long-term member of the statewide LGBTQ IPV Committee, Intimate Partner Violence Committee, which is supported by End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Like Colleen said, welcome everyone to the Department of Children and Family-sponsored webinar on providing inclusive services for LGBTQ victims and survivors. The webinar is one in a series focused on serving LGBTQ victims and survivors of intimate partner violence. So as a reminder, the first webinar, which likely many of you participated in, covered a lot of information about LGBTQ 101 topics. So hopefully after either participating in live or listening to that webinar, folks were able to talk about a brief LGBTQ history and kind of reflect on how that might have affected people getting services now, some terms and concepts related to LGBTQ identities, and then finally similarities and differences between intimate partner violence experienced in LGBTQ relationships compared to non-LGBTQ relationships. The second webinar will build on that knowledge and assumes that you have viewed the first webinar. If you have viewed both or participated in both webinars and still have questions about these topics, we'll have some time at the end today for questions, or you may contact me directly, and a few folks have done that. I think a few folks have also sent questions to Sharon Lewandowski, who was not able to join us today, but will be on the third one. So those are a couple ways that folks can follow up with questions. So the focus of this webinar is how to create an inclusive environment for LGBTQ clients, and also, and this is a nod to some of that federal language, to prevent discrimination, harassment, and bullying that would keep LGBTQ people from accessing services. So we'll begin by exploring which areas of your service provision, physical and otherwise, can communicate inclusion to your clients. Next, we'll address some beliefs that can make it hard to be inclusive. Then we'll discuss common questions service providers have about serving LGBTQ people. And finally, we'll finish with specific actions that you can take to improve your services. So we're just going to jump right in to look at some of those different ways that you can have opportunities to communicate inclusion. So while the impressions made on paper may seem to be a thing of the past, we're always talking about less paper or more electronic communications, what people see and read can have a significant impact on what they think. And with each of these on-paper elements, try to imagine whom you're inviting and whom you're excluding, whether that's overtly or covertly when you communicate on paper, basically. And so even a simple listing, whether it's a referral list, another agency, or in a newsletter, can be a way that people first understand what your agency is about, and likely you are not there to back up that message. Even an agency's name might communicate an unintentional message that the agency only serves some people. For example, if the name of the agency has the word women or men in it for either domestic violence or batterers treatment programs respectively, that might communicate, even if that isn't the reality, that might communicate to people that your agency only serves part of the community. Sometimes an agency name will contain a person's name. Obviously, that agency was likely named after a survivor or another community member. And in that case, you may just have to work harder to communicate that your services are inclusive if you have a gendered name in your agency's name. So just as an example, males may not think that Jane Doe's house has any services for them. So one of the questions that we get a lot on the committee and when we do our in-person training is around forms. So reviewing forms for inclusion can be a sizable undertaking. Much like a listing in a referral source, forms might be a client's first or close to first interaction with your agency, whether that form is completed by the client or used by the provider to guide an intake. LGBT people are often looking for subtle cues that it's safe to be themselves around you, to be open about their relationships and their identities. Forms should allow for relationship status, sex at birth, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And hopefully some of those words and concepts are familiar from the first webinar. More specifics about forms will be covered later in the webinar and in some of the resources listed at the end. So for each of these big headings, like on paper, on phone, we'll return to those in the second kind of half of the webinar and talk about what you can actually do to improve those pieces. So service materials includes everything from brochures to posters to wallet cards to staff business cards. And in some ways, for any of these materials, one should consider what might turn a person away as well as what might include someone. In other words, until recently, and still for some people, the marital status question might turn people away or at least keep them from fully confiding in you. And this is kind of a forms question as well, that if there were no options to indicate that one is in a committed same-sex relationship, for example, that might communicate to people that I guess that agencies weren't thinking of them or thinking about the broad community. Waiting room or reception areas may seem to be less important areas of service provision in which to focus your energy. However, remember that often LGBTQ people are looking for the smallest signs that it's okay to come out to you and that you will provide services that recognize their identities. The inclusion of a national or local LGBTQ magazine or images and posters or materials can start to send that message. And I didn't include specific examples here, but for example, the Fenway Institute has some posters about coming out to providers and has images of LGBTQ people on it. So that's just one example of putting those up and having people see them while they're waiting would communicate a more welcoming environment. Or a local magazine like Our Lives, which is published in Madison, having that as one of the magazines on the stacks might be useful as well. So now let's look at how you can communicate on the phone or online inclusion of LGBTQ people. So to the extent that crisis lines operators might follow a script, whether it's formal or a personalized approach that they've made habit, this very first contact an LGBTQ person might have with your agency and services is crucial. When the majority of clients are women who have male partners, it can be really easy to get in the habit of assuming sexual orientation of the caller and identity of the abusive person. In other words, if a woman calls and says her partner's following her and threatening to kill her, when a person offering support says, "Where is he now?" that woman's being interpreted as straight and her partner as male. If either or both of those assumptions do not match her experience, she may decide to not be as open with you or to not access services at all. So much like in the first webinar, rather than a focus on the exact terms to use before building rapport with a client, a focus on neutral language until you get more information can go a long way. Hand in hand with neutral language is the reminder to not assume. In addition to sexual orientation and identity of the partner, this goes for identity of the clients themselves. So simply asking for pronouns and name can help address these concerns. This is a place where some specific yet comfortable language can be helpful. So you could say something like, "I want to make sure that I address you the way you want to be addressed. What name would you like me to use for you and what pronouns?" And you can give examples if people struggle with that question. Finally, often clients may first come in contact with your agency via your website. Their motivation may be as simple as finding your phone number or as complex as finding out what services you offer for men that would also be sensitive to gay male identities. Often domestic violence and sexual assault service providers' websites are largely geared towards women. For example, the following are some examples of sections of domestic violence websites from around the nation. So one that I found had a question you could click on that said, "Is he really going to change this time?" Now, obviously, for some people, and I guess for gay men as well, anyone who has a male partner might find that a link that they wanted to click on. But for a woman who has a female partner, it's hard to imagine that she would think she should click on that to find out whether her abusive partner might change because it uses the masculine pronoun. Here's another set of quotes from a website that said, first, 80% of all violent crimes committed outside the home are committed by males. It is highly unlikely that women, generally peaceful and nonviolent, would make up half of partner violence. So perhaps people are already seeing where I think that might be problematic. And it was after a statistic that read, when men are battered, it is typically by their male intimate partner. Battering occurs in gay and lesbian relationships at the same rate as heterosexual relationships, approximately 35%. So the second quote, if folks were following along, did a great job of talking about the rate of intimate partner violence in gay and lesbian relationships, but it was followed up by some language that talked about how women are generally peaceful and nonviolent. And so, in this case, to give the developers of that particular language the benefit of the doubt, it may have been that they didn't think about how those two things would sound together. So as you all are looking at your websites, it can be important to think about what messages are we sending on the whole, even though these might have been separate points that they were making. But certainly, again, if a woman were looking at this who had a female partner, it might not be validating of her particular experience. As for social media, and I'll admit I struggled a bit with this one because I wasn't sure to what extent various agencies might be using this and how they're using it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how that might work or not work for LGBTQ people, and then, like I said, towards the end we'll talk about some ways to be more inclusive. So, again, use of this method of communication might vary significantly agency to agency. Often agencies are using these modes to promote events, send messages about how to support victims and survivors, so some like proactive bystander guidance, for example, and then finally to raise awareness about intimate partner violence, along with other purposes. So if we think about these, there are many opportunities to be more inclusive, either by being overtly LGBTQ specific or just by being more neutral. And I think hopefully a theme is emerging here that some of my recommendations are how to be more neutral so that people feel like they can talk to you, and some of my recommendations are about how to be very LGBTQ specific, and often the best approach is a combination of the two, so people both see neutrality but also see their actual experiences reflected. And again, tips will be offered later in the webinar on how to be more inclusive in social media. So now let's turn our attention to actual on-site environment for folks. So when an LGBTQ person enters your space, they will be looking for signs that you are inclusive. First impressions are important and often crucial to a person staying engaged in services. If there's any suggestion that they are in the wrong place or that services are only for heterosexual women, or if their sex or gender identity is misread, it can be hard to build rapport with them. And often it can be habit to address people in a way that would result in these kinds of miscues. So in some cases, this is really easy to do. So some examples are questioning what a man is doing at your agency or why he might be there, or using sir or ma'am based on assumptions of how someone looks. Bathrooms are always a big question around LGBTQ inclusion. Whether they're in a public area or within a shelter, having inclusive bathrooms can be interpreted as a symbol of inclusivity. For example, if there's no men's restroom or no gender-neutral restroom, some clients may not feel comfortable. Some transgender or gender nonconforming people will simply not use the restroom at all if they're not provided with a gender-neutral option. As mentioned earlier, the waiting room or entryway can subtly communicate inclusion or exclusion. Sometimes a good question to ask when evaluating space is really the simplest question, which is how would you can kind of fill in the blank, man, transgender person, lesbian, bisexual person, etc., how would they feel entering this space? And so in other words, would they be able to easily see themselves as a person who is welcome here? As for pronouns and names, we repeatedly address people and refer to them by these markers, and often we use these without checking them out with people first. Sometimes we don't get it right the first time, as we might be using our own assumptions or a name provided on a form without checking that out first. The good news is we can implement some simple ways to catch these errors early, apologize as needed, and then move on. That said, it is incredibly common for service providers and coworkers to not use and respect the names and pronouns a person provides, or to not even ask in the first place. So there's no clear guidance on how to form spaces and services where people of diverse gender identities and orientations may inhabit the same space. In other words, different models have been used for combining or not combining people in terms of gender and orientation in shelter and support groups. For example, some men's support groups have had both heterosexual and gay male victims in them. Some shelters have had transgender women and cisgender women. Remember that term from the first webinar. That means that cisgender means people who identify now as the sex they were assigned at birth. So some shelters have had transgender and cisgender women live in separate areas, and others have had people live in the same common areas. Flexibility and listening to the clients are the key components to addressing multiple identities in one space. And of course, all clients must have fair access to equitable services, which of course brings us to the question of shelter. Easily Shelter is probably the most frequently asked about service in terms of serving LGBTQ people. Be prepared for LGBTQ people to assume that shelter either is just plain not available to them or that they would not be welcome there. The two key questions, and again, we'll come back to each of these areas towards the end of the webinar. The two key questions will be if you provide it to everyone, so all people, particularly under the LGBTQ umbrella, and then how, which includes will people be cohabitating, will the shelter be offered on-site or off-site, and more specific ideas about shelter will be included in the concrete steps sections later in the webinar. And just like that, we're at the first poll. I think there's two of them that we've embedded in this series, so I'll just read this for folks. And the first one is, have you talked with other staff at your agency about the first webinar, which was the LGBTQ 101 that was offered 2 weeks ago today? Options are yes on one-on-one conversations, yes as a group, no, but I have plans to talk, or we are not planning, or I am not planning to talk about the webinar. So just take a second for the responses to roll in. And I'll click on the option for you all to see them as they come in. Great. So as I like to say, the popcorn is slowing. It is not popping as quickly as it was. So it looks like across the responses that nearly everyone, actually everyone, has either talked about it or has plans to talk about it, and that a good, little greater than a third of you have had one-on-one conversations, and about as much have plans to talk about that as well. So I'm glad to hear that people are talking about it, and certainly there are multiple opportunities, like I said, either follow-up questions to any of us, but also through the survey, the link that you all received to evaluate that first one. I'd love to hear your feedback, and certainly it's already begun to inform the next two webinars. All right, so for this next, I think it's about 3 slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the common comments that we get from agencies when they're asked about serving LGBTQ people. And the first one is we already do that, or some version of feeling like they are already serving LGBTQ people really well and being really inclusive. And so often when an agency says this, they really have tried and have had some training on the issue and are likely already implementing some steps to be inclusive. Often, however, some initial steps and ongoing steps will only improve services for some LGBTQ people, because remember that acronym really includes a lot of identities. And sometimes agencies have had a lot of success, for example, making their services more available and more welcoming for lesbians, but haven't made as much progress on some of the other identity groups within that. So another drawback to that statement is that those who have been trained may no longer be at the organization. So often on the committee we talk about what the map looks like what does the map of Wisconsin look like in terms of coverage from our training, and then we always say, well, how far back should we look? Because we know when there are turnover at agencies that means that people who have had the training a few years ago may not be there anymore. So it's easy, and I've done this myself, to go to a training and get really excited about something and go back and start some efforts, but it's sometimes hard to keep that ball rolling when staff changes. So if an organization has had some training or made some effort, these can be really great elements to build on, and they can take a few steps to be sure that they're including everyone and are still moving forward. Some steps may include making sure that current staff have had LGBTQ inclusivity training, such as what we're doing today, having services, including print materials, scripts, we talked about the crisis line scripts a little bit, informal interactions and policies, having all of those tested by LGBTQ people. So, whether that's utilizing the input of the statewide committee, or if you have local folks that could look at it, that can be helpful as well. And then finally, discussing real examples of interactions with LGBTQ clients. So as you're having these small group discussions or one-on-one discussions, it might be great to say, well, how have interactions gone with LGBTQ people, and just being really transparent about what went well and what didn't go well and what you might do differently the next time. Another option is to consult the Northeast Network checklist that's located on the resources slide at the end of this webinar. I think I may have mentioned that organization in the first webinar that has developed a lot of materials around this. So they've developed a checklist that you can use at your agency that includes a lot of the elements that we're already talking about today. So another thing that we often hear from agencies is we don't have any LGBTQ people, LGBTQ people seeking services. So sometimes agencies will say that they just really don't see anyone come through their doors or call, and there might be a few reasons that this seems to be the case. First, staff may not know that there are LGBTQ people among their clients. For several reasons, people may access services without coming out. For example, a woman in a relationship with a woman may decide to change pronouns to appear heterosexual out of fear of homophobia when she accesses services. And I always remind myself that everyone we're talking about is in crisis. So if someone's in crisis and they're deciding whether or not to come out, it might be easier not to on that initial conversation, particularly when they're trying to get some basic needs and safety needs met. Another example would be that transgender people may be utilizing your services without staff knowing that they're transgender. And we talked a little bit about that last time, and I think with all of these, there's sort of the need to know, want to know balance. So it may be that people have already gone through your services without coming out either about gender identity or sexual orientation identities. And so, of course, it may really be the case that no LGBTQ people are accessing services. One explanation might be that folks in these communities have tried to access services but did not feel welcome. So they may have looked at the agency's website, and I gave a couple of examples of things I found on websites that might not be very inclusive. They may have called a crisis line, or they may have heard about an experience of another LGBTQ person and decided not to pursue services. So they may not even have tried to access, so you didn't even have the opportunity to show, at least in the moment, that you were being more inclusive. And finally, LGBTQ people may really not be getting services because they don't think the agency will or can serve them. We talked about this a little bit before. But for example, probably the easiest example is a male-identified person may think that a domestic violence service agency will not help him. So he may not even call there in the first place. And sometimes that can be influenced by the name of the organization, but also just the topic area. I used to ask, especially when I was talking to groups that had men in it, I would ask how many of them had ever seen a power and control wheel, just because I wanted a sense of whether that was a model that was really only posted in women's spaces. So it was sort of interesting to see whether whether men had seen that, or whether they were familiar with it. So regardless of whether LGBTQ people are accessing your services, they are in your community. And since intimate partner violence occurs at least the same rate among LGBTQ people, there are victims in your community in need of LGBTQ inclusive services. And the third one that we often hear is, and often from aspiring allies to LGBTQ people, we hear people say, we treat everybody the same. In fact, what they may be trying to communicate is that they serve everyone, yet even that might be challenging to achieve. So there are a few reasons this belief can get in the way of inclusive services for for LGBTQ people. First, of course, any two clients may differ in their needs, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. In other words, people don't necessarily want to be treated the same. A client-centered approach will ensure that unique needs of clients are heard. There are also some specific reasons that treating everyone the same could leave out the needs of LGBTQ people. The first one is the systems in place may assume heterosexuality. For example, women may be presumed to have male partners, and that's the example I gave before. If you use a male pronoun for the woman's partner before she's confirmed that. Second, services could have been designed for and only ever offered to women. So if a male seeks shelter and the agency does not house men, and this is I'm getting a little technical with the language, but they can't treat everybody the same. Even if they offer hotel vouchers, they can certainly treat people fairly or equitably, but not the same. And then the third one is some service provision or even just language that is used might presume a gender binary. For example, one local provider changed their policy on offering clothing to victims in need to just allow them to select whatever clothes they wanted rather than providing women's clothes to all people with women's bodies. So this was a great, simple way to not presume gender binary, meaning that people that they read as female would want female clothes, and then anyone that looked male would want male clothes, but instead just let people choose what they wanted. So it's just so simple and what might seem subtle can make a really big difference to people accessing services. All right, so next we're going to look at a few questions that are common as we start talking to agencies about including LGBTQ people. So the first one is, what do we do if another shelter resident doesn't want to be housed with somebody who's male, with a transgender person, with a lesbian, etc.? And so the first one is prepare now to include language in all your policies. And I think often agencies feel like they're prepared for this, but then when the situation happens, it can be challenging to sort of act in the moment because we are dealing, obviously with multiple people who have different feelings about different kinds of people and the challenges that can raise in putting people together. And again, always with that umbrella of people that are in crisis. So, for example, if you're going to do some prevention or preparation ahead, being really clear with all clients of services of all services that might include interaction with other clients, if that makes sense. For example, being clear in support groups that all women, including trans women, are eligible for a support group, all people who identify as survivors and identify as women, for example, and being really clear and upfront about that before maybe the situation could arise. Another idea is to develop some normalizing language about all victims, and many of you probably already do this, so it's just a good reminder. For example, saying, everyone that's here is a victim, everyone that's here is a survivor. And that really requires a lot of trust, I think, from the clients and the providers, that the providers will do the work of making sure that victims and survivors are the folks that are in services. And then finally, ensuring that staff are trained in policies so that, and this might be a great opportunity for a role play, which I know everyone gets excited about, but it might be a great opportunity to say, okay, so how would we handle this if somebody was accessing our services who was male, and let's say that you decided that your support groups would be open to men and women, and I'm just kind of making this up, but then, that first male who comes in and tries to utilize services around support group as a victim. And so thinking about what you would have hopefully done ahead of time with the group, and then also, what you would do in the moment, and certainly how you would address pushback. And I think in the third webinar we'll talk a bit about how to address, any pushback that you might get around that. And perhaps that's not the best example. It seems like you might be unlikely to be combining gender around support group, but if you were deciding to do that, it's good to both do some preventative work and also to maybe, like I said, role play that interaction and how that would go. I also wanted to read the Department of Justice frequently asked questions specifically about the Violence Against Women Act non-discrimination provisions. It says explicitly to agencies, and this is the quote, "A recipient may not make a determination about services for one survivor based on the complaints of another survivor when those complaints are based on gender identity. And that's from the U.S. Department of Justice in 2014. So in other words, if someone in a group didn't feel like a transgender woman, for example, belonged in the group, that recipients of this funding that we're talking about could not make the determination about services for the one person based on if the complaints against her were based on gender identity. So hopefully that's a little clearer than I made it, but that's the federal language on it that's supportive of Violence Against Women Act inclusion of LGBTQ people. All right, so the next one is how do we make sure we screen out perpetrators? And I feel like long ago when we started talking about LGBTQ inclusion, this is one of the questions that came up a lot. When we started talking about same-sex couples, people felt uncomfortable with trying to figure out who was the victim or survivor, who was the perpetrator or abuser, making sure that they kept perpetrators out of their services. And I think there was even some effort to develop different screening tools. And so, again, you might hear different people talk about this differently, so you're kind of getting my take on it, and I think the take of maybe some of the committee as a whole, but certainly there are a lot of different beliefs on this. In my opinion, and what I think can work really well, is just recognizing what you all already know. In fact, what I wrote down in my notes is do what you already know, which is recognizing common attitudes and beliefs of abusers or perpetrators and applying that knowledge to the relationships of LGBTQ people. So if we remind ourselves that power and control are at the root of abuse, then we can be reminded that we know what it's like when we talk to a victim or survivor and what that experience is like compared to when we're talking to a perpetrator or an abuser. And so those elements of power and control are still going to be there, and there should be some cues for being able to screen people out, but it's not as if there needs to be a brand new screening tool just because we're talking about, two women or two men. And also I think it's an opportunity as you become more and more astute at doing this to assist other local providers in understanding LGBTQ people and their relationships. Again, so that as people are filtered to your agency, that understanding of power and control is in place so that we can all get victims and survivors the services that they need without screening them out, obviously. All right, and another common question is, can't bisexual women partnering with men, so what might appear to us on visual as a heterosexual relationship, can't bisexual women partnering with men just access services as a heterosexual woman? And perhaps there are some cases where that might work. However, accessing services is different from services being inclusive and sensitive to her sexual orientation. And so the victim might be experiencing emotional and psychological abuse based on their bisexual identity. For example, she may be accused of cheating on her partner or being promiscuous because she's bisexual. She might also have been told that her identity means that she just can't choose whether she's gay or straight, or that it's just a phase. And so failing to acknowledge that identity may sort of re-stimulate those feelings from the relationship, but also not acknowledging it may make it invisible, which could further stigmatize her identity. So one example of how that can look within a relationship is that she may have already been asked by her partner not to tell people that she's bisexual. So two women in a relationship where one identifies as lesbian and one identifies as bisexual, if the one who identifies as lesbian is abusive, she may, as part of that emotional abuse, say, I don't want you to tell anyone that you're bisexual. I don't think that's real, or I think it's just a phase, or whatever. So even if, I guess this is a message that even if relationships look like those of people that you serve in the majority, not being aware of and sensitive to that sexual orientation can actually make it more challenging for the person to feel welcome and included in your services. All right, poll number 2. And here we're starting to edge towards how to put some of this into action. So the question is, to what extent are you able to name places, events, et cetera, in your community where you can do outreach to LGBTQ communities? Options are I can't name any, I can think of one or two, or I can think of several. And, of course, this is one of the challenges in doing outreach is where do I go or who do I talk to? I'll skip to the results. You can see those coming in. So many people, about 2/3 of you, are saying I can think of one or two. I think that's pretty common, particularly if folks are in rural areas. There may only be one or two places, events, gatherings that people might be able to think of. All right, so it looks like the responses have slowed. Overwhelmingly, the response was I can think of one or two, which is great. That means that you may already have in mind, and just, another option I could have put here is we're already doing that, meaning we're already in contact with some of those names, places, et cetera, events in your community where you could do outreach, so that's great to see. All right, so now we're going to go back to each of those different areas that we talked about earlier and talk about what some of the concrete steps are that you can take to be more inclusive. And hopefully this message has come through several times and perhaps is best demonstrated on this slide. Both kind of hand-in-hand being neutral with language so that people can kind of attach onto that and provide you with language. And so I think of neutral language as opening the door to people identifying. Another way to do that, and again, I think these are good hand-in-hand, is to be specifically inclusive. So we'll talk about both of those and how that would look on paper. So again, using neutral language whenever possible. So some examples for these. So relationship status, saying, "Tell me about your relationship," or tell me about the person you're living with. Gender identity can be as simple as how do you identify your gender? How do you identify yourself as male, female, or some other identity? Sexual orientation, you could use that as how do you identify your intimate partners? Are you attracted to men, to women, to transgender people? Any of the above. And then finally, for pronouns, I think a statement of inclusion, and then also maybe offering some options. So saying something like, I'd like to use the most respectful language for you and about you. What pronouns would you like me to use for you? And, of course, some common responses might be she, her, and hers, or someone might say female pronouns. Likewise, male pronouns, he, him, his. Some people will use, particularly some transgender people, might use they, them, or theirs, and that one takes a little bit of practice, but certainly there's a movement towards using that. And as a colleague of mine pointed out, we do this all the time. So an example would be someone saying, "Oh, I saw my doctor today," and the friend saying, "Oh, what did they say?" Like if you didn't know if the doctor was male or female. So it might seem cumbersome, and yet I think, on the whole, we have some practice using that. So asking people what pronouns they like to use, you might also ask about the pronouns for their partner as well. And then getting more specific in how to do that, revising questions on intakes to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And my overarching recommendation, and again, there's a lot of differing opinions on this, but is to always include an opportunity in each category for people to write in their answers. And I would stay away from using the word other and then a blank, just because there's a kind of negative connotation with using the word other or calling someone other. So, for example, and there, of course, we could talk all day about what the drop-down responses should be, but a relatively simple one for sexual orientation might be straight, which actually there's research showing that the use of the word straight is more successful than heterosexual, just it's more common language that people identify with. So straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and then a line. And sometimes people will write in something different, and if they write in something that you don't understand, then it's your opportunity to say, "Oh, I see that you identified your sexual orientation as blank. What do you want me to know about that?" Or, "That's not a term I'm familiar with. Can you tell me what that means?" And then gender identity, again, there's a lot of controversy of how to do this, but having male, female. So some agencies go really simple and say we're going to do male, female, transgender, and a line. Some other agencies have decided to do male, female, male to female, or MTF, and female to male, TM, and then also a line. So again, we could talk all day about what the list should look like. I think including a blank line really makes it more inclusive, and also if I were filling that out, that would say to me that this provider has thought about people who might be filling it out and is open to hearing something that's not on the list. And, LGBTQ people know that they might have to explain terminology. And so it's better to have the opportunity to communicate that on the outset. And I'm not sure if I said this or if this is coming up, but sometimes when people are asking about transgender identities, they'll use a two-question combo, and that is, what was your sex assigned at birth? And then, what is your gender identity now? And, that may or may not be helpful depending on the services that you're providing, but it does allow people to identify as something other than cisgender, which is the term we used earlier, and to communicate to you that they identify differently now, regardless of what their body is like or whether or not they've had used hormones or anything like that, that they identify differently than their sex assigned at birth. And that's actually a way that in some more clinical fields that those questions are being asked, so kind of a two-question combo. All right, so the next one, more concrete steps on paper. The first one is to include images that reflect LGBTQ people. And I mentioned the Fenway Institute has a couple of posters on that. I think they have one in English and Spanish, and they also have a youth one. And this is sort of interesting because what they tell people to do after looking at the message on the poster is come out to your provider. Your provider wants you to come out to them. And so, of course, that's assuming that the agency is ready to hear that and ready to serve people that are LGBTQ. So again, it's kind of like the safe space sticker conversation that we often have, which is if you're going to put out something like that, you need to be prepared to hear people's responses and be prepared to serve people well. The next one is indicating any limitations to receiving services, whether that's for men or for transgender people, and offer alternatives. And so I always think it's best to be really clear. And so if there are services that are not currently available to men or that they look a little bit different, I think it's important to be really clear about that and about what it does look like. And people will appreciate, I think, the upfront honesty rather than having to ask a lot of questions to find out whether or not those services are available. To be inclusive in any lists about anti-discrimination, I think we talk a lot about non-discrimination clauses, and we think, oh, we have one of those, so that'll be inclusive. But it is important to really look at it and make sure that it specifically outlines sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in the anti-discrimination language. And we'll talk in the third webinar more specifically about those policy pieces and how to actually use that language. So this is that piece is a little bit of a preview for that. And then finally, on paper, including examples of LGBTQ-specific abuse tactics in materials. Again, that can be assigned to somebody that you've thought about them and that you're aware of some of the unique issues. So, for example, if you were listing, has your partner ever done any of these things, you could include something. A simple one would be, has your partner threatened to tell someone else about your sexual orientation or gender identity? So if an LGBTQ person saw that, then they might think, hey, they've thought about me, and they've thought about the type of abuse that's happening specifically in my relationship. All right, so now we're going to look back again at on the phone and online and some concrete steps there. So the first, hopefully we're getting more and more tangible here, is scripting a template for crisis line operators that uses neutral language. And again, one thing that often comes up here is you may have a script that's already really neutral, but you may find that people have gotten into a habit of, for example, presuming heterosexuality. So when a woman calls, presuming that the abusive person or her partner is male. So it can be useful then to, of course, train crisis line staff or volunteers in using neutral language and then actually role-play calls from LGBTQ people. So testing that out. So some things that you might encourage people to say are, tell me about the person who's hurting you. How do you refer to that person? And just using that really neutral language. And often you don't have to use it long before the person will provide you with, names, pronouns, some sort of descriptor of how they're talking about boyfriend, girlfriend, etc., partner. So the neutral language is to open the door until you get more specific language, and then using the language that they've provided. And then finally, on this one, communicating clearly any services that are not provided to men or transgender people and offering the alternative. So that came up in the on-paper, but also on phone and online, and being prepared for how to respond to that if your agency's not quite there yet, or is currently offering an option and hoping to offer a more equal option in the future. Just being really clear about where you're at. All right, so one more on phone and online. So in addition to your own read on your website, be sure that you have an LGBTQ staff person or persons, volunteer, or other community people to also give it a close read. It never hurts to get more input, and asking someone to read it with a specific lens can really focus that input. I know, and several of you may have this experience too, of someone asking you to read something with a specific intent in mind, and that can be really useful. Have somebody read this and say, read this, ask a gay man and say, read this and tell me where you feel welcome and where you don't, or where you think we're being inclusive and where we're not, or even just after you've read this, what services do you think we have available for you? That can be really useful feedback to get, and it also obviously communicates to the people that are reviewing it that you're trying to be more inclusive. So now we're going to return to look a little bit at the social media piece we talked about earlier. Social media may have a somewhat limited use in this field. It can definitely be used proactively. And as with many things, both what you say and what you do not say can have an impact on who you reach. So using neutral language like partner and avoiding pronouns in more general posts can go a long way. That said, being specific can also send a powerful message. So this is that whole neutral versus specific piece that we've been talking about. Some events you may want to post about include National Coming Out Day, which is in October, various pride events, particularly if they're local to your community. Those are usually in the summer. And Transgender Day of Remembrance. In addition, as you're sharing examples of victim and survivor stories and ways to support them, ways to support victims and survivors, be sure to consciously include stories of the lives of LGBTQ people, including examples of types of abuse that are specific to LGBTQ relationships, like threatening to out a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. All right, now we'll return to looking at concrete things you can do on-site to make your services more inclusive. So the first one is just to require that new staff view the first webinar, and probably the second one, and sending staff to a full-day training on inclusion, and requiring that for, obviously, for new hires. Both demonstrating and using inclusive language in both your policies, but and not only with clients, but also in staff meetings and conversations. And this is not just for LGBTQ people. Using that inclusive language can help people on a spectrum of different relationship status, different gender identity, and you may not know that there are folks that are LGBTQ. Again, both within your clients, but also within your staff. Making restrooms gender neutral and single stalled if possible. And sometimes people can feel a little bit overwhelmed by this because it sounds like a construction project, when in fact any single-stalled restroom can easily be made gender-neutral, often just by changing the sign, or you can offer to have a gender-neutral restroom for every female or male set. And often, particularly if you already have single-stalled with a lock on it, that can be probably the easiest transition for making restrooms more accessible. And another thing to be mindful about is making sure that your gender-neutral restrooms aren't, up on third floor in the back of the building, but that they really are accessible for people. Developing strategies to house LGBTQ people in shelter and safe housing of equal quality. A lot of times people want to hear about exactly how to do this, and I think the first place to start, of course, is who do you shelter on site, and then what are the alternatives that you offer. And remember, particularly if we're thinking about transgender people, relying on the gender identity that they identify, regardless of whether you think that other people would necessarily interpret them that way. And I think, it's really a challenge because trying to figure out whether services are equal. For example, if we put up someone being sheltered on site at a domestic violence shelter and someone being sheltered in a hotel, there's the are they both equally safe question, but also are they getting equal services? Do they both have access to whatever the package of services might be, food, social support, someone to talk to, support group, et cetera. And so a lot of agencies are struggling with this, and unfortunately the federal guidance is not clear, although I assume that's going to be coming, that there will be more and more clarity. And there are already folks, shelters that are sheltering men in their shelters. Some are having men sheltered in hotels. Some have a wing or a specific designated room. Same thing with transgender people. So there are a lot of models out there, and like I said, there's not really clear federal guidance. But I guess the question is always, is it the same and is it equal? And trying to work towards, certainly towards equal. All right, a few more things about on-site. Identifying staff to maintain LGBTQ inclusivity policies, materials, and practices. So you may or may not have someone who's LGBTQ identified on your staff and out and open about that. But you might also have somebody who has a lot of energy around this issue and would like to be the person who's kind of in charge of keeping an eye on this. I think that can be really helpful, and certainly the statewide committee can support that person in being sort of the on-site champion. Other things you can do on-site, using pronouns and names provided by staff and the individuals you serve. That shows transparency and also builds rapport and reputation with the community. In other words, if you have staff people who are LGBTQ and they are treated well and feel included and supported, they're also part of that community of LGBTQ people and survivors that might be accessing your services. So that can go a long way towards communicating that message to a larger community. And then finally, supporting ongoing professional development on the topic of LGBTQ inclusion. We're offering these webinars, we have a full-day training, and there are certainly other national and local opportunities for people to get some professional development. One of them in membership on the statewide committee, and for folks who want more information on that, they can contact me directly. But also encouraging presence at LGBTQ events like transgender, Day of Remembrance events, Pride events, some of those outreach opportunities that we talked about. Speaking of outreach, one common question we hear from providers is how to do outreach in LGBTQ communities to inform them about services and to communicate inclusivity. One obvious first step is to think about where to find people, and we talked about that a little bit in the poll. Obviously, this varies wildly based on the type of community within which you live. Some options include LGBTQ community centers, universities, and high school gay-straight alliances, as well as any known hangouts or social gathering places, which might include bars, restaurants, community sports teams, or other social venues. One challenge to anticipate is that the perpetrators are likely to be in those spaces with their partners as well. And again, that isn't entirely unique to this community, but with a small, close-knit community, that's often the case. So that can present some challenges around how to reach victims and survivors, or at least to how in-depth you can reach people. There are at least two key messages to communicate. The first is what services you offer to the population. Be clear about what services are open to men, transgender people, women, etc. The second is to demonstrate an understanding of the community. In other words, using language that is inclusive and also addressing unique issues to LGBTQ people. For example, be sure you're using terms like partner or person or the pronoun they in your materials. Again, the use of they can be a sort of a great neutralizer. Yet also use some specific language like we talked about, saying if your partner is threatening to tell other people about your sexual orientation or identity. So giving some of those specific types. This brings us to the next point on unique issues. One unique issue is having partners in the same venue. This is not to say this dynamic's never at play for non-LGBTQ people, but it's just more likely here. With a small enmeshed community, you're more likely that people will have dual relationships. For example, you could be doing outreach at a venue where the perpetrator volunteers or works because it's an LGBTQ venue. Also, just because you're at an LGBTQ event, don't assume people will be out or that everyone there is identifying as LGBTQ. All of these unique issues can be addressed with some basic counseling skills, such as open-ended questions, using inclusive neutral language, and really focusing on the individual and what they're telling you about themselves. Finally, you'll need to back up those messages. Again, prevention is the best approach here. Don't oversell your services in terms of who's eligible, and be specific about referrals to your agency. Is there someone they should speak to who's experienced with their identity group? In other words, you can give a name of someone who is maybe your expert in some of these issues. That can be really helpful and really validating for people and make it more likely that they'll contact you. If they need a service your agency can't provide, be ready with a reliable referral, which will also build trust and community rapport. So I sped up because we are almost done here. Just briefly, a look back at the objectives that we set out for today, which hopefully we're sort of building on those as these go through. Those were understand what areas of your environment and service provision can communicate inclusion, address beliefs that inhibit inclusion of LGBTQ people, provide some solutions to common questions about LGBTQ access to your services, and then finally name concrete steps to improve your services. In the third and final webinar, we'll address the development of policies to ensure an environment free of bullying and harassment of LGBTQ people. While this webinar today finally largely focused on what victims and survivors see and experience, the next webinar will focus on employee policies and policies to protect the people you serve. So if you have a chance to do some homework before the next one, you could find out what types of policies are already in place and where there are opportunities to be more inclusive. So like take a look at your non-discrimination policy, any policies you might use in support group, to ground rules, that kind of thing.
This concludes the webinar, Creating a Welcoming and Inclusive Environment and Services for LGBTQ People. Again, thanks for joining us today. And this was recorded on